Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, you're just back from Afghanistan. Give us a sense of what really is happening there, because there's so much activity in Doha. There's talk about something happening in Oslo as well, and Kabul ultimately probably will also be involved. But what is the sense you're getting?
Well, firstly, I think on my visit to Kabul, it just happened to be coinciding with the 100th anniversary of the Afghanistan's National Independence Day. Just 2 days before that, there had been a very terrible bomb blast in which a wedding party with, with at least 60 to 70 deaths and over 150 casualties. So the mood was positively somber, and the Afghan government also curtailed the kind of celebrations that were planned for it with the reopening of the Darul Aman palace, which had been lying destroyed for a long time. So contradictory messages, in a way, 100th year of the Afghan independence, the restoration of the Darul Aman, but also a wedding, a really bad wedding blast. And all this is taking place in the shadow of the Doha talks, where almost every day there's a news that it's about to happen the next day. I think in general, amongst the public that we were able to meet in the short visit, there was a tremendous sense of foreboding and confusion among the people. A sense of confusion where they didn't know. Nobody really knew what was happening. In many cases, they were basically just following what their leaders were telling them, but also a sort of deep suspicion of what even their own leadership were up to, because there's a sense that perhaps many of the leaders were looking after their own interests rather than the national interest. And in the political circles as well, I would say there was a sense that somehow things are being decided and things will be decided outside, and almost a resignation that things are being decided outside, and that they themselves don't have much agency behind that. But in contrast to that, I would also tell you that there were several people who were, very much possessed with this notion of Afghan independence and Afghan sovereignty. And that night, on the Independence Day night, Kabul was jammed with traffic. People coming out on the streets, showing partly a defiance, but also showing a celebration. And other figures talking about, in basically defiant terms, about what is likely to come. So I had the sense that there was both gloom and a great deal of confusion, a distrust of what is happening behind the scenes, but finally also a sense of defiance.
When you're talking about the shadow of the 9th round now in Doha that's happening, lots of reports suggesting that the tail is in the tail, so as to speak. We're expecting some kind of an agreement, draft, deal, I don't know what it's going to be called.
Well, it's a lot of this is happening behind closed doors. Even in Afghanistan, the general sense is people complain that they are being kept out of everything. I heard about, the Speaker of one of the Houses of Parliament telling the US ambassador that, I'm the Speaker of the House of Parliament and I don't know anything about what is happening. So that's as deep as it goes. So I think it's very difficult to know exactly what is happening behind the scenes. But my sense is that there is still quite a lot in the details that is left to go. And that kind of daily news that we get that it's about to happen this day or this week may just get stretched out. I could still be surprised. And the details are simply this. I think there's a general understanding on a pullout and guarantees against, harboring international terrorists. But, what is the kind of actions that are required? What are the lists that would be the targets? How do you monitor or verify this? What is going to be the sequencing of the pullout and the verification? And of course, in the midst of this, the daily toll of violence which Afghans are feeling continues completely unabated, if anything, with even greater savagery. And also the entry of newer elements, in particular, as you know, that wedding blast credit was taken by the Daesh. So there's also this kind of, there's also this aura of a new threat lurking in the background.
So this foreboding, would that be fueling it, in the sense, even if there is an agreement between the Taliban or factions of the Taliban and the US, and then subsequently take it into some kind of intra-Afghan discussions, that the bloodshed will continue because there's this new element now. It's been there, it's been around for a while, but it's raising its head at this particular juncture.
Spectre. Yes, exactly. So People are feeling that this is the same thing in a new bottle. People are talking about a division of labor. People are talking about, well, all right, we'll keep our guarantee in the territories that we control, but there are territories that others control. And by the way, even from the point of view of the Taliban itself, I mean, there was that kind of, so to say, aspirational promise in the last round of talks when, some of the Afghan representatives also met the Taliban, that there would be a reduction in violence. We see no reduction in violence. And in fact, we see, even the Taliban, let alone other elements, actually claiming credit for the violence that is taking place and saying that, this is part of the war that is going on and this is not part of the peace talks.
So he knows the spokesperson of the Islamic Emirates in Doha was being quoted as saying when 2 Americans were the latest to have been killed. That's a very positive thing. That we were not responsible for 9/11, Al-Qaeda.
Right.
What is the sense that you're getting from the Afghans in terms of trusting the Taliban? Have they changed? Do the Afghans think they've changed in any manner?
Right.
Except for the fact that they're much better at PR now.
Right. So that's a very interesting question because by and large, unfortunately, there's also a kind of bit of an ethnic divide on this. By and large, nobody believes promises of, so-called peace and reduction in violence. This is on the one hand, nobody believes that. On the other hand, we did come across people who said that, for the sake of peace, we have to take a chance, and they are agreeable to X, Y, and Z, maybe even elections and, various other things. But when you actually probe them and say, do you think that this agreement will hold? Will the Taliban agree to a stable government? Will the Taliban agree to power sharing in any, extended framework? Even amongst the supporters, there was great skepticism whether any interim agreement or any agreement would hold. And I think that is the point that I would like to highlight. The point is that you may reach some kind of agreements, let's say in the months coming, between some people and some people. But how, in the absence of an agreement with the government that controls the country, how is the sanctity of that agreement to be met? And particularly if the Taliban insists that they are not dealing with the government, but they're dealing with individuals, what kind of authority will those individuals carry for a largely skeptical public? And, the history of Afghanistan is, now there is even talk about divisions within the Taliban. And you've heard of that mosque blast in Quetta in which Mullah Hebatullah's brother was killed. So, we're not even talking about divisions between the Afghan government and the Taliban. We are talking about divisions within the Republicans. We are talking about areas being out of control. And then once you have this agreement, there will be people who will be in and people who will be out. And there are a number of other fissures that are in operation. So it's very difficult to see a kind of stable, evolution. Of course, people always hope for the best, and I agree with all those who say that we must give peace a chance and we must also hope for the best. But at some point, you also have to, envisage end states and scenarios, and in a way prepare for those end states and scenarios.
You're saying a large possibility is of one of those end state scenarios being a return to a similar sort of situation that you had before the Taliban came into power.
Yeah. Well, I hate to be a kind of Cassandra in this, but the more I think about it and the more I look at it, it's very difficult to escape that conclusion. And in a way it's logical. Look, the United States has been the glue that has in a way bound this entire process over the last 18, 20 years. And people will tell you that there has been, contrary to the narrative that we often hear that it's a largely, that Afghanistan is in a state of mess. Actually, there's remarkable, development. I mean, even in this visit to Kabul, if you looked at the commercial life, the street life, at one level it's normal. At another level, there has been a lot of construction, a lot of shops, business organizations, commercial establishments, a consumer economy that has even survived the, so to say, the transition all this time. And most of all, I think, as a point that I made in the past, there is a new generation that has come up, a generation that has been educated, a generation that is more and more urbanized. There's been a rural-urban kind of shift, a demographic shift, and a much more contemporary and modern outlook. And
very aware of technology.
Correct.
And use it a lot.
And you have achievements in art, you have achievements in sports, cricket, but there are several other things, skiing in Bamiyan. Yeah. And there are a whole set of new heroes coming up in Afghanistan. And that part of the story, which is a kind of, I think Amrullah Saleh likes to use this particular metaphor of a phoenix rising from the ashes, is also evident. And I think it's important to remember that. This is, there's a tremendous sense of defeatism and resignation at one level, but at another level, there is also a determination to reclaim and to fight back.
Again, if you look in the past, whether there were doubts about what will happen in 2014 or specific events that were possibly thought to, look down the tunnel, but they've overcome those, so to speak.
Yeah, but I think the situation is grimmest now. It's extraordinary that it is more grim when there is talk of peace than when, in a way, the war and terrorism was at its highest.
You've been speaking a cross-section of people and interacting with them, including top leaders and big names. What is their view on what India has been doing and is doing currently?
Yeah.
Are they satisfied?
Look, I think the fact is that over these last 18 years, starting from a position of relative handicap, which is the post-Soviet and post-Taliban period, most people will tell you that we have, captured a place in Afghan hearts and minds. So I think that has been a very positive kind of accomplishment, and it has been achieved, I think, with some intelligence. The feeling amongst the friends of India is that perhaps India could do more, and particularly could do more in the political area in helping the Afghans. And I think I mentioned to you,
unify the political.
Yeah, there are two ways. One is, I think the Afghan voice is generally lost, and that is speaking externally. But internally, just to play a kind of calming and unifying role, and giving a kind of quiet moral or political support from the back. I think these are two kinds of roles. I think there are other things that probably could have been done. I mean, personally, I feel that while we have done a great job in the development side, and I think we've done quite a commendable job on the commercial side as well, by offering the Indian market, and I think this is a very big thing. I think perhaps the international community, I don't think it's only India, could have done more to make the Afghan economy a little more sustainable in terms of even small investments in small businesses, processing of their agri-products in order to be able to get better markets. And I think that sort of thing perhaps could have been done.
You spoke to the ex-NSA and ex-Foreign Minister Rangin Daftar Spanta, and he was also mentioning what we were talking about earlier, that Oslo could emerge as a center of some kind of movement again.
Right. Well, as you know, I mean, people are looking for a venue for the intra-Afghan talks, and the Norwegians have always offered, have been playing the role of a kind of good office in many of these peace negotiations. So that way, I think Oslo carries a certain image and credibility, and I think the Europeans are also likely to have a larger role in this part of the process. So it seems as though, I mean, it could be Oslo, maybe it could be another European capital as well, or maybe it could continue to be Doha. But I think the sense is that it is likely to be Oslo.
Yeah, we were talking about the sequencing of at least the first two pillars of agreements that should be fructified in we don't know when. But in terms of guarantors, you were talking about, say, even the Taliban assuring the Americans and the international community that they have no links with other terrorist groups. Now, who verifies that? Yeah. This talk of the Taliban having backers or guarantors in this part of the agreement from the Russians, the Chinese and Pakistan.
Yeah.
How does all this really work?
I'm not sure. When you talk to even the Afghans, the Afghans will tell you that, after all, there has been quite a large movement of so-called terrorists, even from Pakistan through different parts of Afghanistan, and they say it's very difficult to tell, an Afghan from a terrorist, right? Or even an external terrorist sometimes. So I think this problem is going to be there on a much grander scale once this whole business about, preventing Afghan soil from being, a center for international terrorists. So I think that problem will continue. Now, the fact is that the Russians, even the Iranians and the Chinese all have their own concerns about security and about terrorism. And I think they would be well aware that once the Americans leave, in a way their role and will increase in terms of, of course some countries even suspect the Americans of playing a role in fomenting and actually contributing to that. But leaving that aside, the fact is that they will be drawn in to looking after their own security concerns. Now, I don't know if that would be a guarantor for the American side of the agreement.
No.
Absolutely
No.
not.
No.
So, but there is a danger for them, I would say, that they would get sucked in and embroiled more and more in much the same ways that the Americans have got. And I'm sure they would be conscious and wary of that. Which means that almost everything, and then there's of course the fact that Pakistan will continue to play a major role, whoever it is, partly because of language, partly because of ethnicity and many other factors. So, I mean, on the whole, it will be a murky situation in which they will also be wary and frankly, they could also be misled and fooled.
India being wary of Pakistan's role, and if you move slightly further to what you were talking about, possible inevitability of an end result there,
Right.
apart from
Result in where?
in Afghanistan,
Right.
which will probably be a lot of chaos.
Right.
So if Pakistan is controlling elements of the Taliban that have reached into power structures, government, state, etc., there's Daesh, which is also apparently just another name for these various organizations. How wary should India be of that?
You see, one
situation?
difference from, I think, 96 is that at that time, through the Taliban, and the Taliban was also under Mullah Umar, clearly more cohesive, I think you had even the Taliban were a more stable kind of entity. And I think Pakistan had much more control over that because of various reasons. I think even Pakistan would be aware that today their ability to control all the various players, even within the Taliban but outside the Taliban, whether or not they are behind a part of Daesh, let's assume that they are not. Then again, how can they control that? And if they are, then what would be the relations with various other kinds of the strands of this terrorist phenomenon? So I think even the Pakistanis are not in as good a position as before. And some people would say that that it also suits the Pakistanis, because in case the Taliban were to display the kind of independence that Pakistan would fear, or the kind of Afghan nationalism, in that case it would be good to have a countervailing force to be able to keep them unstable. So I think that's very, very likely.
And how does India deal with, I would even say the US, but with President Donald Trump when he says that, Pakistan and India are right there. They should be dealing with this problem, not America, which is 7,000 kilometers.
Yeah, this is part of this phenomenon that we have seen, that you try to export the Afghan problem to a kind of India-Pakistan problem. The fact is that under no sort of, norm or convention or international law can you justify, interference in a third country over what is a bilateral issue. And I say interference is a very mild word. When we are talking about the kind of scale of violence and terrorism that is being used as a weapon of war in Afghanistan, then we are not talking about interference in internal affairs, typically what states talk about. I mean, you're talking about a very extreme form of interference. So there is absolutely no justification to export a problem to outside. Unfortunately, Pakistan is not averse to making those links, and I think the best answer came from the Afghan government itself in response to their ambassador in Washington.
Even the Taliban statement on Kashmir and Afghanistan, but
Makes
his
clear that there is no
simplistic
link.
argument, if it's to his own constituency, this President Trump, where he's trying to say that you guys should be dealing with the problem. Forget the link between Afghanistan and Kashmir that is being brought up by Islamabad, but you should be dealing with the problem. Why should the Americans? Now, it does have a resonance among certain people in his constituency,
Right.
even if it's a simplistic argument.
Right. Look, as far as India is concerned, I think we have been trying to deal with this through various processes. You know, there's the Heart of Asia process. We have been trying to deal with it within the UN format. We have been dealing with it in the context of our bilateral relations.
He probably means boots on the ground.
Yeah, boots on the ground. Completely.
As in,
and look,
why
this
should
is
they
not
be
the first
American?
time that he has said this, but I think, you know, just because, I mean, I think it comes down to the same question that he thinks we are part of the problem. We are not part of the problem in Afghanistan. And you cannot just export a problem from India, Pakistan and say, all right, this, Afghanistan is the venue of that, theater of that problem. I mean, we reject that linkage. I think the Afghans reject that linkage. And now you see even the Taliban have rejected that linkage. If President Trump, with due respect to him, continues to hammer this, I think he needs to look at his talking points a little closer.
You don't visualize any possibility of NATO has been involved in different forms, ISAF, the Americans, some kind of international peacekeeping force that would avoid this end chaos that you're talking about, even if it's through the United Nations
one
Security
of the
Council?
reasons why this whole thing is taking place is fatigue. I mean, after all, you've had US and NATO forces at one time going up to, almost 150,000 troops, unable to control the situation. And of course, that inability is not only military, that inability is for many other factors. And I think that is it. I think the fact is that at various stages, all the actors have known where the problem is, but they have not been willing to address that problem. That problem is not so much in Afghanistan as elsewhere. And actually, the best statement on this was given by President Obama during his campaign trail. And if I can just take you back to that, during his campaign trail, he said that Iraq was a war of choice. Afghanistan was a war of necessity. In Afghanistan, the theater of the war is Afghanistan, but the locus of the war lies somewhere else. And instead, I think it was in Pakistan. And that was the background behind Holbrooke's mission and that AFPAC special envoy, because there was a linkage between these two. Yeah. But having said that, once he came into power, President Obama's position also changed, and he began to think in terms of withdrawal, was persuaded for a while to do a surge and then a withdrawal, but then never really took the logic of his own analysis pre-election into his administration to address the problem at home. And there were times even during that time, if you remember the Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, visiting Delhi and then visiting Pakistan also, and actually very openly and bluntly, including their, Mullen, who was then their, General Mullen, who was then their Joint Chief of Staff, very specifically identifying the problem in Pakistan, saying that, for example, that the Haqqani network was an instrument of the ISI, but not taking it to its logical conclusion politically, diplomatically, and any other method there may have been. So I think that is the problem. The problem is that if you don't go back to the root of the problem, and look, let's see the irony of this, which is not often realized. Technically, today you have the US has a strategic partnership agreement and a bilaterally security agreement with the Afghan government.
So but they dealing with the Taliban, not with their security partner.
In international law, they are their military and political backers. They are their strategic backers. And suddenly you have an ally, an effective ally, who has informally, because there's nothing formal about this, has suddenly assumed the role of a kind of mediator, and in fact actually mediating with the Taliban government, with the Taliban, not the government, in which the Afghan government is like a kind of a pleader, you know. It's today, people told me in Afghanistan that it looks as though the Taliban are the government and the Afghan government is trying to get a share in the future Afghan government, you know. So it's complete turning of tables. And on the other hand, there is no let up in the backing and the, you know, safe havens and the shelter that the Taliban have in Pakistan. So it's not like an element, if the Americans have been removed from one part of the equation or have removed themselves from one part of the equation, it's not that Pakistan is removed from the other part of the equation. So there's a complete, you know, imbalance.
We've talked about the political process and the presidential polls before as well. Has anything changed on that front in terms of it coming up loggerheads to a possible peace deal, or is it giving President Ghani some kind of a fillip in a way?
So again, there was a lot of confusion about this in Kabul. In Kabul, very few people believed that, a few people who were not part of the government or not who were actually electioneering, even many of those who were candidates, were not sure if the elections would take place. And to be honest, it was not easy, much electioneering was not visible. On the other hand, it was very clear from the President Ghani's camp, and I think also from the CEO's camp, that, and also some other elections, that they were in any case going to go through the motions of an election. I wouldn't like to speculate on the shape and outcome. I think on the part of India and the part of myself, I would say that we would like to see a credible and successful election, because that would give the future government a kind of authority and legitimacy with which to actually negotiate with the Taliban.
Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, thanks again. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure
to do these
to be
talks
with you
very often, I think.
Right, I know. Well, I think, it is important for the people of India to know more about Afghanistan. We have very few media correspondents actually based there, reporting directly from the ground. And of course, Afghanistan and India have a special relationship, and our people have a special relationship. So that people to people, the dialogue and what is happening at the level of the Afghan people needs to be better known in India instead of being reflected through media reports from all over the world.
Other lenses.
Yes.
Thanks again, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you.